Shooter ready? Stand by. Welcome back to Shooter Ready with me, Jon Shank. Today, we'll be discussing my experience taking ShivWorks ECQC, or Extreme Close Quarters Concepts class, something that I've been looking forward to for a long time. It came highly recommended to me by a number of friends and associates as the class for anyone who's serious about self-defense. Before we get into the meat of it, this being the first class review, I want to take a minute to elaborate on how I will meditate on these training events. At the end of the episode, I'm not going to say if the class was good or bad, or give it a star rating or some other arbitrary metric. A friend once told me that life is too short for bad training, so I try to avoid those altogether. Instead, I'd like to focus on the content of the class, what I learned, what my personal takeaways were, and who I would recommend the class for. From there, you can decide if that sounds like something that aligns with your training goals. Today, in particular, I'll give you a brief overview of the class, what the required skills and equipment are, and a day-to-day breakdown of the exercises and activities I participated in. Now, let's make ready. ECQC, an acronym for Extreme Close Quarters Concepts, was more or less described to me as jiu-jitsu with guns and knives. Sold. What else do you need, right? It's an unusual class in that, while there is a shooting component, it's not a shooting class. There's grappling, a little bit of striking, weapon retention, some wrestling and jiu-jitsu, but also there's a lot of coverage dedicated to soft skills, such as threat identification and assessment, communication, and decision-making. That sounds like a lot to cover, and you're right, it is. But the instructors are knowledgeable, articulate, and do a great job of making the information manageable. The instructors, Craig and Brian, for my session, were both veteran law enforcement officers with a wealth of history and experience to draw upon that directly relates to the content of the class. In regards to requirements, I'll admit that I went into ECQC somewhat cold because I wanted to get the most out of it by not gaming it. As it turns out, a lot of my previous experiences applied here, but I still learned a lot. With that said, here is some spoiler-free info on what you should have in order to sign up for the class. The only skill that I would say is a hard requirement for this class is to be safe and confident enough with your handgun to be able to draw it from concealment at speed. Everything else covered in the class is very beginner-friendly. For equipment, very little in the way of gear is required. Ammo, your handgun, and a holster. Most students preferred to use concealed holsters carrying appendix inside the waistband. I started the class with a battle belt, but decided to switch over to a borrowed inside the waistband holster about halfway through the second day for reasons I'll touch on in a bit. A cup is highly recommended for men who take the class. The reason is probably obvious, but let's just say that I'm very thankful that I brought one because I think I hold the world record for getting shot in the junk with sim rounds. It happened a lot. A nice to have for this class would have been to have a fixed blade training knife. I really had my eyes opened in regards to the applications of concealed fixed blades, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on later. Physically, this isn't a high-impact, high-exertion class, but there are a lot of hands-on, force-on-force components to it. It's up to you to regulate yourself accordingly. Don't let that scare you, though. To me, the value of the class is really found in discovering how you contend with others under stress. So now, let's break it down day by day. Day one was shorter, starting later in the evening. After the class and the students were all introduced, we went over some material on communication, a silent mindset, and the pre-assault indicators, with the intent of priming us for the evolutions of the next day. The TLDR on the content of this night was learning about various mannerisms that people unintentionally exhibit when they're about to commit an assault, how to recognize them, and primers on how to respond appropriately that we would go into in more detail throughout the class. We then did our first exercise, which was rotating through other students in the class and taking turns exhibiting and identifying various pre-assault indicators and kind of going through how we would react in those situations with the instructors giving us the pros and cons of various approaches. The second day was where things got real. It started off fairly simple. Most of the demonstrations of various biomechanical principles and how they applied to being used on other humans. Basically, we pushed each other around a lot, but it was pretty educational. After doing various drills of that nature for a while, we wrapped up the second day with our first evolution. I realize I may have dropped the term evolutions a handful of times already without explaining what it means, but it's essentially the practical application of the tools and techniques that you've learned in the class thus far to see how well you can leverage them against other people. So, back on topic, the first evolution went something like this. The good guy starts with a concealed gun and laying on their back. The bad guy starts standing up, and if or when, and only if or when, they see the good guy's gun, they try to take it away from them. Easy enough, right? I'm 5'10 and 250, so while I'm not a big guy, I'm on the bigger side of average. That's what they all say, right? So, of course, I got paired up with one of the two guys who were bigger than me in class. During my good guy phase, I started on my back. I'd never been good at playing guard in jiu-jitsu, so this guy was on top of me right away, laying across my chest. I couldn't get access to the sim gun without pretty much handing it to him. But then it occurred to me that if I had a small knife, I had a real opportunity to go for this guy's neck or throat. This guy adjusted his position and came down on my sternum with all of his weight. And since my battle belt had an IFAK pouch mounted in my lower back, my spine bent in a way to make it feel like I got snapped in half, and I tapped immediately. Not gonna lie, that was a pretty embarrassing way to start things off. So 2 lessons here, maybe 3. Carry a small fixed blade knife. Don't go around in a battle belt. And if I do go around in a battle belt, don't go to ground in a battle belt. Oh, 4 takeaways, I guess. If I do go to ground in a battle belt, make sure that I don't have an IFAK pouch mounted in my lower back. Now, for my turn as the bad guy, I was actually doing pretty well. I got past the guy's guard. I got on top of him, got him in a crossbody, just like he did to me. We wrestled a little bit, and he managed to shrug me off. We kind of reared up at each other, and I'm pretty sure this looked like a nature documentary where bears were fighting over territory or something. But I was able to get him in a headlock and bring him down on all 4s, and I was pretty proud of myself until he managed to get out his gun and promptly used it to shoot me in the dick. You'll notice that this becomes a theme. Let's just say the cup paid for itself. Day 3 was a busy day. We started off with shooting drills. In the spirit of the class, most of these were shooting from position 2 or 3. This is extreme close quarters. For those uninitiated, that's close enough to smell the theoretical bad guy's breath. Special attention was paid to how to shoot from this distance safely and accurately, as well as some basics on how to defend yourself when you're within striking distance, and perhaps even more importantly, how to gain additional distance. This is the point where about halfway through, I ditched my battle belt setup and opted to borrow someone's spare inside the waistband holster. I think it was actively working against me, in particular during my first evolution. And since I was taking this class mainly with being a self-defense oriented civilian in mind, it wasn't helping me with drawing from concealment at all. Once I switched over to the inside the waistband holster, things were a lot smoother all around, and I got some pretty good reps in with drawing from concealment. After that, we moved on to some grappling basics, wrist and bicep ties mostly. And we were also introduced to some weapon retention techniques, which it seems self-explanatory, I guess, but it's how to retain your weapon should it be in your holster or should you have drawn it and someone tries to disarm you. I think these were super useful, and I wish we had a little bit more time to practice them, but we had other things to do, like more evolutions. We did a handful of them, most of which I was able to avoid going hands-on, with my partners, occasionally thanks to me feigning like I only spoke Polish and not English. A little confusion will get you a long way sometimes. We ended the day and the class with the final evolution. If you follow ShivWorks on social media, you've probably witnessed the fight in a car situation. For this one, I got paired with the other guy in my class who just happened to be my height, but was significantly larger than me. As I learned in my turn as the bad guy, he was not afraid to throw his weight around. Nothing too exciting in this particular scenario, but after a lot of fumbling, I managed to draw my gun and shoot him in the very top of the head with a sim round. Good thing we were wearing those big goofy helmets. Now, my turn as the good guy was very educational. It's hard not to game it because you know something is going to happen. So I was primed and ready, or so I thought. As soon as the bad guy's gun came out, my -5 stripe white belt brain thought, control the wrist. So I grabbed the wrist of the hand that was holding the gun with my dominant hand and used my legs to push off the inside of the car door to pin him in place. Which worked until I discovered that he could still shoot the gun while I was holding his wrist. Note to self, control the gun next time. Duh. Needless to say, I got shot in the junk a few more times while we were wrestling around for the duration of the exercise. While the class was more of a review than I expected, the things that I learned were pretty eye-opening. My key takeaways from ECQC were, number 1, I need to train my grappling against people my size or larger. I'm not a huge guy, but just big enough to be intimidating. It's unlikely that someone's going to pick a fight with me. No one has yet. But if someone decides to change that, they're probably going to have either a height or weight or maybe both advantage on me, and I should prepare accordingly. Number 2 is a small fixed blade would make an excellent addition to my EDC. In the evolutions that went hands-on, we were often operating in such a proximity as to make drawing or shooting difficult, dangerous, or impractical. However, in most, if not all, of these scenarios, it would have been easier to deploy and use a small knife effectively. The students in the class who did have small fixed blade trainers tended to make excellent use of them. Let's just say it would have been a hell of a crime scene if this had been a real thing. Number 3 is I need to be cognizant of using jiu-jitsu techniques in a self-defense scenario as opposed to doing jiu-jitsu and/or jiu-jitsu brain. The most white belt of white belt mistakes. Pro tip, if someone has a weapon, you might want to take control of the weapon or the hand with the weapon in it instead of the wrist holding the weapon. The more you know. Number 4 is tactical improv is a thing. There were several students in the class who were just so good at rolling with the scenarios and keeping people on their toes that they were often able to talk themselves into or out of things regardless of their training partner's intent. Number 5 is getting shot in the dick sucks, and not in a fun or sexy way. Having completed the class, I can see why it was so highly recommended. This is the most well-rounded self-defense class that I've taken to date. While, like I said, it was mostly review, thanks to other courses I've taken in the past, the content of this specific class offers such a significant breadth of techniques that it makes it the most efficient and effective primer on this material. Additionally, squaring up against the other students in evolutions is the safest way that I can think of to train under that fight or flight stress somewhat realistically. I would absolutely recommend this class to anyone who is serious about self-defense and carries a handgun or a knife or both. ECQC tends to sell out fast. It took me 3 years to finally land a spot. So keep an eye on the ShivWorks website and be ready to go when you get the chance. Thanks for joining me on my journey through ShivWorks ECQC. I hope you found it useful and enjoyable. If so, you're in luck. There's plenty of more classes to discuss. But before we get to that, our next episode will feature an interview with Tony Lopez, Southside Chicagoan, Army veteran, and my personal guerrilla fitness Yoda. Questions, comments, suggestions? Send it. Find me at shooterready.fm or on all the socials, as the kids say, as Shooter Ready FM. That's Instagram, X, or Twitter, or whatever they're calling it now, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. I look forward to your feedback.